I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the line of expensive cars parked near my cabin. My peaceful lakeside hideaway had been invaded, and the culprit was none other than Diane Reynolds, the meanest HOA president our community had ever seen. The thumping music hit my ears before I even reached the property. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my old Toyota as I pulled up behind a shiny Mercedes. Through the trees, I could see colorful balloons tied to my porch railing and a banner that read Diane's Lakeside Party. This couldn't be happening. I had taken time off work specifically to enjoy some quiet days at my grandfather's cabin. The place had been in our family for 3 generations, and now someone else was using it without my permission. Before you watch full story, comment down your country name, I would love to hear. I walked toward the noise, my anger building with each step. At least 20 people in fancy swimwear were scattered across my property. Some were swimming off my dock, others lounged on furniture I'd never seen before. My grandfather's handmade wooden chairs were nowhere to be seen. And there she was, Diane Reynolds, holding court in the center of it all. Her perfect blonde bob didn't move an inch as she laughed loudly, waving a champagne glass. She wore an expensive white swimsuit and designer sunglasses, looking like she owned the place. "What is going on here?" I demanded, loud enough to make nearby conversations stop. Diane turned, surprise flashing across her face for just a moment before her practiced smile returned. "Oh, Parker. What a nice surprise," she said as if I was the unexpected visitor. "You should have told us you were coming up midweek. You could have carpooled with someone." "This is my cabin, Diane. How did you get in? Why are all these people here?" She waved her hand dismissively. "As HOA president, I have access to all properties for inspection purposes. It's in the bylaws." She directed this last part to her audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. "This isn't an inspection," I said, pointing at the party around us. "This is breaking and entering. And where are my grandfather's chairs? Those old things? We moved them to make room for proper seating. They're in your shed." Honestly, they were a safety hazard with all those splinters. I was about to explode when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a notification from my security system. Someone had just tried to access my hidden alarm panel inside the cabin. That's when I understood what was really happening. Diane wasn't just throwing an unauthorized party, she was using it as cover while someone searched my cabin. After a break-in last winter, I had installed several hidden cameras and a second alarm system that most people didn't know about. I forced myself to stay calm. "You know what, Diane? You're right. It is a nice day for a party. Let me freshen up and I'll join you in a few minutes." Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose in surprise. "Of course, Parker. How accommodating of you." Inside my cabin, I found 2 men in suits rifling through my desk drawers. One was standing at my hidden alarm panel, which was concealed behind a false bookshelf now standing open. "Can I help you gentlemen find something?" I asked loudly. They spun around, startled. The one at the desk recovered first. "Ah, you must be the owner. Diane asked us to locate some property documents. There seems to be some confusion about the boundary lines." I pulled out my phone and took several photos of them before they could react. "And does locating documents usually involve breaking into a hidden alarm panel?" "Look, there's been a misunderstanding," said the man at the alarm panel. "We're on the HOA legal team. Diane authorized us to access any relevant property documents. Is it standard procedure to bypass electronic locks too? Because that's what someone did to get in here today." The men exchanged glances. "I think we should continue this conversation with Diane present," the first one said. "There are aspects of the property situation you may not be aware of." "I'm aware of plenty," I replied, "including the fact that you're both trespassing. But by all means, let's involve Diane. And while we're at it, let's also involve Sheriff Johnson. I'm sure he'd be interested in this standard procedure of yours." I made as if to dial my phone, and the men quickly moved toward the door. "That won't be necessary," one said. "We'll clear this up with Diane." After they left, I locked the door behind them and checked my security system. Someone had professionally bypassed the main electronic lock, but they hadn't discovered all my security measures. The hidden cameras were still recording, having captured everything from the moment the first intruders arrived. I quickly downloaded the security footage to my phone, then checked my grandfather's old desk. The false bottom in the main drawer was undisturbed. They hadn't found the original property deeds or the documentation I'd been gathering about Diane's HOA violations. I secured these documents in my car before returning to the party. Diane was speaking with the 2 men I'd confronted. When she saw me, she approached with renewed confidence. "Parker, I believe we need to have a frank discussion about your property boundaries," she said. "My legal team has identified some discrepancies in the records." "Is that why you broke into my cabin and threw a party? To discuss property boundaries?" Diane lowered her voice. "Don't be difficult, Parker. Lakeside Shores is planning an expansion of community facilities, and this cove is the ideal location. The HOA is prepared to make you a very generous offer for this quaint little cabin, significantly above market value." So that was it. Diane wanted my property for an HOA expansion and had engineered this entire situation to pressure me into selling. "You know, Diane," I said, matching her quiet tone, "there's something you should understand about this cabin. My grandfather built it with his own hands after returning from World War II. He designed it with certain features that most people don't notice." Diane's expression showed only impatient boredom. "And one of those features," I continued, "is that almost everything in this cabin is rigged to record. The bookshelf your men opened records automatically. The desk they were searching also records. Even this conversation right now is being recorded from multiple angles." Diane's perfect poise faltered. "That's absurd. And if true, potentially illegal surveillance." I smiled. "Not in a private residence when responding to a break-in. And definitely not illegal when capturing evidence of trespassing, breaking and entering, and attempted property fraud." I paused, letting that sink in. "But you know what's interesting about all this footage I've been collecting? It doesn't just show today's activities. I have months of documentation showing your selective enforcement of HOA rules, your use of association funds for personal purposes, and your systematic harassment of anyone who opposes your community improvement projects." The color drained from Diane's face, though she quickly tried to recover. "You're bluffing. And making accusations that could be considered defamatory. Truth is an absolute defense against defamation, Diane. But I'm sure you know that, being so well versed in legal matters." I glanced significantly at her legal team, who were now looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Now here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to end this party immediately. Everyone is going to leave my property. You're going to personally oversee the restoration of everything to exactly how it was before you broke in, including returning my grandfather's chairs to the deck. And then you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation about the future of Lakeside Shores." Diane's eyes darted around, calculating her options. After a moment, she forced a bright smile. "Well, everyone," she called out, clapping her hands twice, "it seems our lovely soiree needs to wrap up a bit early. Our host has other plans for the evening. Let's gather our things and head back to the clubhouse." The party dispersed with surprising efficiency, guests clearly accustomed to following Diane's commands without question. Within 20 minutes, only Diane, her two legal advisors, and the cleanup crew remained. When we were finally alone, Diane's pleasant facade vanished. "You've made a serious mistake, Parker. The HOA board won't take kindly to these accusations, especially when backed by illegally obtained recordings. That's the second time you've tried to claim my security footage is illegal, Diane." "It's not. But you know what is illegal." I held up my phone showing her footage of caterers unloading vans clearly marked with the Lakeside Shores HOA logo. "Using HOA funds to pay for a private party." I swiped to another clip. "Or accessing private property without authorization." I swiped again. "Or attempting to alter property records." Diane's composure cracked completely. "What do you want? Money? A position on the board? Whatever it is, let's be reasonable." "I want 3 things," I said calmly. "First, your immediate resignation from the HOA board. Second, a full financial audit of HOA accounts during your tenure, conducted by an independent firm. And third, a written admission of your violations to be presented at the next community meeting." "That's absurd. I'd be ruined." "Your reputation is already ruined," I finished for her. "The only question is whether it happens publicly, with criminal charges, or relatively privately within the community. Your choice." Diane stared at me with undisguised hatred. "You've been planning this all along. Setting traps, gathering evidence, waiting for me to make a mistake." "No, Diane. I installed security after the break-in last winter, which, now that I think about it, probably wasn't a random occurrence either, was it? The recordings only became a trap when you decided to break into my cabin and try to force me to sell." The next morning, I was surprised to see Margaret Wilson, the HOA treasurer, driving up to my cabin. Margaret was a retired accountant who had always seemed reasonable despite her friendship with Diane. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Margaret said, clutching her leather portfolio like a shield. "Diane Reynolds asked me to deliver this." She handed me an envelope. She also instructed me to inform you that she's tendered her resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. I opened the envelope to find a signed confession acknowledging unauthorized entry to my property, misuse of HOA funds, and administrative irregularities in the application of community guidelines. The language was carefully crafted by a lawyer to admit wrongdoing while minimizing legal liability. "There's something else you should know," Margaret added, her voice lowered. "I've suspected financial problems for some time but couldn't prove anything. Diane controlled all the accounts and intimidated anyone who asked questions." She opened her portfolio. "These are copies of transactions I found questionable. If you're serious about an audit, these might help." I studied Margaret with new respect. "You've been keeping records all along?" Margaret nodded. "My husband was on the board before Diane took over. He always said HOAs are only as good as the people running them, and the best protection against corruption is transparency." She sighed. "After Diane forced him out, I stayed on as treasurer to keep an eye on things. I just never had enough proof to challenge her directly." "Until now," I said, accepting the financial documents. "Until now," Margaret agreed. "There are others who'll be relieved she's gone. Diane's been trying to force several homeowners to sell, always people with prime lakefront property. There's a rumor she's been working with a developer who wants to build luxury condos. Over the next few weeks, the transformation of Lakeside Shores was remarkable. With Diane gone, neighbors who had been intimidated into silence began sharing their experiences. The HOA board, now led by Margaret as interim president, voted unanimously to conduct a thorough financial audit, which ultimately revealed that Diane had diverted over $150,000 of association funds for personal use and unauthorized projects. The community meeting where these findings were presented was the most well-attended in Lakeside Shores history. Homeowners who'd rarely spoken to each other were now engaged in active discussion about bylaws reform, reasonable enforcement of community standards, and the proper role of an HOA in preserving property values without infringing on individual rights. As for Diane, the consequences of her actions extended beyond her resignation. The financial audit triggered a tax investigation, and while she avoided criminal charges through a settlement agreement, her reputation was irreparably damaged. She listed her lakefront house for sale and moved away. 3 months after Diane's lakeside party, I hosted a very different gathering at my cabin. The newly elected HOA board members, including Margaret as president and myself as secretary, met to finalize the revised community bylaws. We sat in my grandfather's wooden chairs, arranged in a circle on the deck overlooking the lake, sharing ideas and listening to each other with genuine respect, a stark contrast to Diane's dictatorial approach. As the meeting concluded and people began to leave, Margaret stayed behind. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said, running her hand along the smooth arm of the chair she'd been sitting in. "Not just of how you stood up to Diane, but of how you've helped rebuild the community." I looked out over the lake, its surface painted gold by the setting sun. "He used to say that good neighbors aren't the ones who never disagree, but the ones who know how to disagree respectfully." I smiled at the memory. He built this cabin to last generations with hidden strengths most people never notice. I guess I wanted our community to have that same kind of foundation. Margaret nodded, understanding perfectly. "Well, you've certainly helped us start building that foundation. And all because Diane didn't realize she was walking into a trap when she hijacked your cabin." "The best traps," I said, "are the ones that don't look like traps at all. Just like the best communities don't need to be controlled, just respected and protected." As Margaret drove away, I remained on the deck, watching the last light fade from the sky. My grandfather's journal lay open on the small table between the chairs, his neat handwriting documenting the history of this land and the community that had grown around it. I added my own entry, recording not just what had happened with Diane and the HOA, but what we were building in its place, a neighborhood where rules existed to serve the residents, not control them. The lake lapped gently at the shore, a soothing rhythm that had remained unchanged through generations of human drama. My grandfather had chosen this spot for its peace and natural beauty values that no HOA dictator could ever truly appreciate. In the end, it wasn't my hidden cameras or security systems that had protected this place. It was the strength of a community finally finding its voice, and the enduring legacy of a man who believed in building things to last. The cabin stood as it always had, weathered but strong, a testament to skill and care rather than show and control. In that way, it was the perfect symbol for what Lakeside Shores was becoming, a community built on respect for the past and commitment to a better future, with hidden strengths that would protect it for generations to come. 6 months after Diane's departure, the changes in our community were even more apparent. The spring thaw had brought new energy to lakeside shores, and with it came the first community-wide cleanup day that anyone could remember. Nearly every homeowner participated, working together to clear winter debris from common areas, repair the old playground that had been neglected during Diane's reign, and plant flowers along the main entrance. I watched from my dock as children and adults alike worked side by side, sharing tools and laughing together. This was what a real community looked like, not the sterile, controlled environment Diane had tried to create, but something organic and alive, with all the beautiful imperfections that came with it. Quite a change, isn't it? The voice came from behind me. I turned to see Thomas Chin, an elderly resident who had lived in Lakeside Shores even longer than my family had owned our cabin. He leaned on his walking stick, smiling at the scene before us. "It certainly is," I agreed, offering him one of my grandfather's chairs. He accepted gratefully, easing his aging frame into the solid wooden seat. "I remember when your grandfather first built this place," Thomas said, his eyes taking on a distant look. "People thought he was crazy building so far from the main beach. But he said he wanted peace more than convenience." I hadn't known that detail. "Did you know him well?" Thomas nodded. "We served together, though in different units. After the war, several veterans settled around this lake. We understood each other, you see. What we needed was quiet and the sound of water, not more noise and chaos." He gestured toward the community gathering across the lake. Diane never understood that. She moved here from the city and immediately wanted to change everything, make it more like the place she'd left behind. Fancy clubhouses and tennis courts and rules about what color you could paint your mailbox. He shook his head. "What's the point of living by a lake if you can't enjoy the nature of it?" The audit revealed she had plans to build condos right here, I told him. "Multiple units where this cabin stands." Thomas snorted. "I'm not surprised. She approached me too, you know. Offered twice what my place is worth. Did you consider it?" "Not for a second," he replied firmly. "My wife is buried on that property. We got special permission back when that was still possible. No amount of money would make me leave her." I hadn't known that either, and felt a newfound respect for the quiet man who had always waved to me from across the cove but had never sought conversation until now. "Anyway," Thomas continued, "I wanted to thank you." Standing up to Diane took courage. Not many would have done it. I shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just protected what was mine." "You did more than that," Thomas insisted. "You protected what was ours, the spirit of this place. That's why I came by today. I have something for you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, weathered and smooth from handling. "Your grandfather gave this to me for safekeeping many years ago. Said I'd know when it was time to pass it on. I think that time is now." Curious, I accepted the box. It was heavier than it looked, with no visible latch or opening mechanism. I turned it over in my hands, examining each side carefully. Thomas chuckled. "He said you'd figure it out if you were paying attention." I smiled, remembering my grandfather's love of puzzles and hidden compartments. I studied the box more carefully, noticing slight variations in the wood grain on one side. Pressing gently in sequence, I felt a small click and the top of the box slid open. Inside lay a folded piece of paper and an old brass key, green with age. I opened the paper first, a hand-drawn map of the lake, with several areas marked with symbols I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked. "The future," Thomas said simply. "Or maybe the past. Depends on how you look at it." He pointed to one of the symbols near our cove. "That's where we are now. And these others? They're the original homesteads, the first cabins built by veterans after the war." "Including yours?" He nodded. "All of us had similar ideas: find peace, build something with our hands, leave something for our children. But as time passed and properties changed hands, that vision got lost. Newer owners didn't know the history, didn't understand what we were trying to preserve." "And the key?" I asked, picking up the heavy brass object. "That opens the original community boathouse. Most people don't even know it exists anymore. It's almost completely hidden by overgrowth on the far side of the lake. Inside is a records box with the original community charter." My eyes widened. The original charter? Before the HOA was formed. Thomas smiled. "Long before. When rules were simple and focused on preserving the lake and helping neighbors, not on property values and approved paint colors." "Why are you giving this to me now?" "Because Margaret told me about the new bylaws you're helping draft. She said you keep talking about balance between individual rights and community responsibilities. That's exactly what our original charter was about. He leaned forward, suddenly intense. Diane wasn't the first to try changing lakeside shores into something it wasn't meant to be, and she won't be the last. Developers have had their eyes on this lake for decades. What you found in your security recordings, that was just the tip of the iceberg. This revelation stunned me. There's more? Much more, Thomas confirmed. That's the other reason I'm here. Some of us older residents have been keeping records for years of suspicious zoning requests, unusual property transfers, environmental studies that got buried. We never had enough to act on, but with what you've uncovered about Diane. I felt the weight of his words. You think there's a larger plan at work? Beyond just my cabin? I know there is, he said grimly. Diane was working with Westlake Development Corporation. They've been buying up lakefront properties through shell companies for years, waiting until they have enough contiguous land to bypass individual zoning restrictions. And my grandfather knew about this? Thomas nodded. He was the one who started keeping records. That's why I think your traps were more than just coincidence. Your grandfather was always preparing for this battle. He just didn't live to fight it himself. The implications were overwhelming. What I had thought was just Diane's personal greed might actually be part of a much larger threat to the entire lake community. The documentation I had gathered suddenly seemed like merely the first pieces of a much larger puzzle. What should we do with all this information? I asked. Thomas stood up slowly, using his walking stick for support. That's for you to decide. Some of us are too old for another fight. But I thought you should know what you've stepped into. He placed a weathered hand on my shoulder. Come by my place tomorrow. The others would like to meet you, the ones who still remember what this place was meant to be. After Thomas left, I sat for a long time with the box open in my lap, studying the map and wondering what other secrets lay hidden around the lake. The key felt heavy in my palm, both a connection to the past and possibly the key to Lakeside Shore's future. The next day, I followed Thomas's directions to the old boathouse. It was indeed nearly invisible, covered in decades of vine growth and surrounded by tall pines that had grown up around it. Without the map, I would never have found it. The brass key turned with difficulty in the rusted lock, but eventually the old wooden door swung open with a groan. Inside, sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes and slanted beams. The air smelled of old wood, lake water, and time. Against the far wall stood a metal box, similar to an old military footlocker. Another lock, another key, this one hidden under a loose floorboard exactly where Thomas's map indicated it would be. Inside the footlocker lay the history of Lakeside Shores, carefully preserved. The original charter, handwritten on faded paper, photographs of the first cabins, journals kept by the original owners, and most surprisingly, detailed records of every attempt over the decades to develop the lake beyond its intended purpose. I spent hours reading through the documents, piecing together a story that spanned generations. My grandfather and his friends hadn't just built cabins, they had created a legacy, a vision for how people could live alongside nature without destroying it. And they had been fighting to protect that vision long before I was born. That evening, I arrived at Thomas's cabin to find 5 other elderly residents waiting for me. They introduced themselves one by one: Eleanor Watson, whose father had been the lake's first permanent resident; Michael Yamamoto, whose family had faced discrimination when they first tried to buy property but had been welcomed by the veterans; Frank Williams, who had helped my grandfather build our cabin; and Maria Lopez, who had been maintaining the community record since my grandfather's death. We call ourselves the Lake Guardians, Thomas explained with a slight smile. Sounds dramatic, I know, but it started as a joke 50 years ago and somehow stuck. We've been waiting for someone from the younger generation to take up the cause, Eleanor added, her voice frail but determined. When Thomas told us what happened with your cabin and Diane, we hoped it might be you. But why me? I asked. There are other younger residents whose families have been here for generations. Frank leaned forward in his chair. Because you found the traps without being told where to look. What do you mean? Your grandfather didn't just build security features into that cabin after he died, Frank explained. He built them from the beginning. The false bottoms in the drawers, the hidden compartments, the reinforced walls with space for modern security. He designed it all back in the 40s, long before such things were common. But why? What was he protecting against? Maria spoke up, her accent still strong despite decades in America. Not what? Oh. Even back then there were people who saw the lake and thought only of profit. Your grandfather understood that each generation would face the same fight, just wearing different faces. I thought of Diane in her white swimsuit, raising a champagne glass on my deck. So Diane was just the latest in a long line. They all nodded. And Westlake Development? I asked. Thomas exchanged glances with the others before responding. They've been around for about 20 years, but they're just the current face. Before them it was Lakeview Properties, and before that Shoreline Investments. Different names, same goal. Which is? To turn our community into a resort destination, Eleanor said, disgust evident in her voice. Condos, timeshares, a golf course, restaurants, all the things people think they want until they realize what they've lost. The development plans in that footlocker, I said, some of them go back decades. And they all failed, Michael replied with quiet pride. Because every time they tried we found a way to stop them. Environmental protections, historical designations, zoning challenges, whatever tools we could find. But we're running out of time, Thomas added soberly. We're not getting any younger, and Westlake is more sophisticated than previous developers. They've been playing a long game, buying properties one by one, placing people like Diane in positions of power, changing regulations incrementally so no one notices the bigger picture. I thought about the documentation I'd gathered on Diane, the security footage from my cabin, and the historical records I'd discovered. Separately they were just pieces. Together they told a story that stretched back decades, a story of quiet resistance against forces that would forever change the character of our lakeside community. What do you need from me? I asked finally. The elders exchanged glances and Thomas nodded. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. This is everything we've gathered on Westlake Development and their current plans, she said, sliding it across the table to me. Their CEO is meeting with county officials next month to propose a lakeside revitalization project. They already have commitments from owners of 7 properties. 8 if they had gotten your cabin, Frank added. I opened the folder and scanned the first few pages, complex diagrams of proposed development, financial projections, and most disturbingly, a list of Lakeside Shores properties with notes about each owner's resistance level and acquisition strategy. My cabin was listed as high priority with the note, owner emotionally attached but financially vulnerable. Use HOA pressure tactics. They've been studying us, I said, feeling a chill despite the warm evening. Like scientists observing animals, Eleanor agreed bitterly. Learning our weaknesses, planning the best way to remove us from our homes. I continued flipping through the documents, increasingly disturbed by their thoroughness. How did you get all this? We have allies, Thomas said simply. People who understand what we're trying to preserve. One works in the county planning office. Another at the bank that's financing Westlake. They pass along what they can. This is incredible, I said, overwhelmed by both the scope of the threat and the dedication of these elderly residents who had been fighting silently for years. And now you understand why your standing up to Diane was so important, Thomas said. You didn't just protect your cabin. You disrupted a plan years in the making. The question is, what will you do next? I looked around at the faces watching me, lined with age but bright with determination and hope. They had carried this burden for decades, maintaining vigilance when no one else recognized the threat. Now they were asking me to join their cause, to become a guardian of not just my own property but of an entire way of life. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but so was the sense of connection to something larger than myself, to my grandfather's legacy, to the community he had helped build, to the natural beauty of a lake that deserved protection. I'll need help, I said finally. Not just from you, but from others in the community who might not know what's at stake. Thomas smiled and I saw relief in the faces around me. That's why we wanted you to have the original charter. It's not just a historical document, it's a reminder of what we're fighting for. A vision of how people can live in harmony with nature and with each other. Then let's make sure everyone else sees that vision too, I said, feeling a new resolve building within me. Starting with the new HOA board. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with the Lake Guardians, integrating their historical knowledge with my modern technological skills. Together, we digitized their records, created a secure database of evidence against Westlake Development, and began carefully sharing our findings with trusted community members. Margaret, as the new HOA president, was the first to understand the full scope of what we were facing. This is bigger than anything I imagined, she said after reviewing our evidence. No wonder Diane was so desperate to get your cabin. With Margaret's help, we formed a new community preservation committee, officially sanctioned by the HOA but operating with the quiet intensity of the original Lake Guardians. We organized community events centered around the lake's history, inviting longtime residents to share stories that newer homeowners had never heard. Slowly but surely, A new consciousness began to emerge in lakeside shores, a recognition that what made our community special wasn't property values or exclusive amenities, but the delicate balance between human habitation and natural beauty that the original founders had worked so hard to maintain. When Westlake Development presented their revitalization plan to the county board, they found themselves facing not just a handful of elderly protesters, but an organized community prepared with counterproposals, environmental impact studies, and historical preservation arguments. Their sleek corporate presentation faltered in the face of authentic community solidarity. The battle wasn't won in a single meeting, of course. Westlake had resources, political connections, and a determination born of potential profits. But we had something more powerful, a community that had rediscovered its voice and its purpose. My cabin, with its hidden strengths and carefully preserved history, became a symbol of our resistance, not just against corporate development, but against the idea that everything in life should be assigned a monetary value. 1 year after Diane's lakeside party, I hosted another gathering at my cabin. This time, the guests included both the original lake guardians and newer residents who had joined our preservation efforts. Children played on the shore while adults shared stories on the deck, sitting in both my grandfather's original chairs and new ones built by a local craftsman who had used the same techniques my grandfather had learned decades ago. As the sun began to set, casting long golden reflections across the water, Thomas raised a glass in toast. "To Parker," he said, nodding in my direction. "Who discovered that the best trap isn't made of steel or circuitry, but of community." "And to the lake," I added, raising my own glass. "May it continue to trap all of us in its beauty for generations to come." The cabin stood as it always had, weathered but strong, a testament to skill and care rather than show and control. In that way, it was the perfect symbol for what Lakeside Shores was becoming, a community built on respect for the past and commitment to a better future, with hidden strengths that would protect it for generations to come.